sort of this diplomacy speak of irregular channels. This was a conspiracy theory. The New York Times has described, right, aides as saying Donald Trump's mind had been poisoned, and he used his personal aide to remove her because she stood in the way of what? Just explain for our viewers what she was blocking.
Mr. Giuliani was meeting with Yuri Lutsenko, then the prosecutor general, to get him to open an investigation of Hunter Biden. Why did he want to do that? Because Vice President Biden at the time was the leading opponent of President Trump for next election. Whether he was or not in the future, back then he was. That's why he's talking to Lutsenko. There's no other reason. This notion that they were concerned with corruption of all the corrupt companies and individuals in Ukraine. Why are they focused on one American? They don't even talk about the company, by the way. One American who serves on the board of directors. Obviously, it's because he's the son of the vice president and a future possible presidential candidate next year. Ambassador Yovanovitch wanted nothing of this. She thought this was wrong. She took on Prosecutor General Lutsenko for this and many other things, by the way. That's why they then went to the president and said, we got to get rid of this ambassador. And remember, President Trump doesn't seem to know many of his ambassadors. We just learned a few weeks ago, he barely even knows Ambassador Sondland. This notion that somehow her performance in Ukraine was wrong and that he was going to get into the weeds of that. By the way, just to underscore, incredibly unprecedented for somebody to be removed midterm in their career, midterm in their assignment, I mean. That, let's just be clear, this was to do with the drug deal. And I think we need to keep getting back to that and not getting too distracted in the smearing was bad, but it was for a reason. We need to keep asking, why was Yovanovitch removed? It's because she was trying to block this alternative thing to help the president be reelected.
A perfect summary. Ambassador Yovanovitch is back. Let's listen
Return
in.
to order. Mr. Jordan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you for being here. Thank you for your service to our country. Ambassador, should ambassadors ever try to influence host country elections?
No.
I think you said in your opening statement, partisanship of this type is not compatible with the role of a career foreign service officer. Is that right?
Yeah.
But that's exactly what happened in 2016. In August of 2016, the very month you went to Ukraine as our ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador here in the United States, Ambassador Chali, wrote an op-ed in The Hill, said this: Trump's comments send wrong message. So the very month you're over there as our ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador Chali writes that op-ed, and it wasn't just that attack, as Mr. Castor got into earlier, it wasn't just that attack on the president. We had former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, who criticized candidate Trump. We had Mr. Avakov. I believe earlier you said, Ambassador, that Mr. Avakov was the individual who first alerted you to the efforts of Mr. Giuliani. Mr. Avakov, back during this same time period in the months just prior to the 2016 election, called then candidate Trump all kinds of names, called him a terrorist. And of course we have Mr. Lyshenko, a member of parliament, who was a source for Fusion GPS and the now somewhat famous dossier that flowed from Fusion's work. He said this in the Financial Times again in August of 2016 when you first arrived in Ukraine. He said this: the majority of Ukrainian politicians are on Hillary Clinton's side. So you had several high-ranking officials in the government, in the Ukrainian government, and when President Poroshenko was president of Ukraine, criticized President Trump, then candidate Trump, all in the late summer and fall of 2016. What I want to know, Ambassador, when this was all happening, did you go talk to anyone in the Ukrainian government about this? Did you go say to some of these officials, hey, you guys need to knock this off, this perception that we got, as Mr. Lyshenko said, the majority of Ukrainian politicians on Hillary Clinton's side, that's not good. Did you have that conversation?
No.
Didn't talk to anyone in the government? Did you talk to President Poroshenko?
No.
Didn't alert anyone in the government?
No.
Well, one of the things we've heard so much over the last 6 weeks in depositions, and frankly in the hearing on Wednesday, is how important bipartisan support is for Ukraine. Democrats and Republicans agree they want to help Ukraine. In fact, the Democrats' first witness, their star witness on Wednesday, Mr. Taylor said Ukraine's most important strategic asset is this bipartisan support. And you would agree with that, right?
I do.
He said this in his testimony on Wednesday. On September 11th, I learned that the hold had been lifted the next day. Ambassador Taylor said, I conveyed this news to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian foreign minister, and I reminded Mr. Yarmuk of the high strategic value of bipartisan support for Ukraine and the importance of not getting involved in other countries' elections. So what I'm wondering is, this is the day after the aid's been lifted that Ambassador Taylor made this statement to the Ukrainian government. And he makes this after there's nothing been done by Ukraine to influence our election. Because President Zelensky didn't announce he was doing an investigation and the aid was lifted. But he felt he needed to say that. But in 2016, when we know that the majority of Ukrainian politicians want Clinton to win, because it was said by a member of parliament, when the ambassador to the United States from Ukraine writes an op-ed criticizing then candidate Trump, when Mr. Avakov calls candidate Trump all kinds of names, nobody goes and talks to him and tells him to knock it off. Did you have any conversations, Ambassador, with Victoria Nuland or Secretary of State Perry about what was going on in 2016 and this majority of Ukrainian politicians being for candidate Clinton and not and opposed to President Trump?
No, I did not.
No one did anything. No one did anything. You see why maybe the president was a little concerned about what went on in Ukraine? And you couple that with the corruption level that we know exists in Ukraine, you add to that this idea that he's not a big fan of foreign aid, why he might be a little concerned about sending the hard-earned tax dollars of the American people to Ukraine?
I'm sorry, is there a question there?
There was.
Okay, could you repeat it, please?
I'm asking.
Time of the gentleman has expired, but I'll let you to repeat the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm asking, maybe we can kind of see why the president was a little concerned when you have the highest ranking officials in the government, the ambassador criticizing him, parliamentary member Lashchenko criticizing him, when you have Avakov, the guy who first told you about Giuliani, criticizing him. All this going on, and when you couple that with the concerns he has about corruption, the concerns he has about Europe not doing enough, the concerns he has about reluctance to send in the hard-earned tax dollars to any country,
Jordan,
frankly.
I have indulged you with extra time, but
I appreciate it.
Indulgence is wearing out.
I appreciate it.
There is a question, right?
Our indulgence wore out with you a long time ago, Mr. Chairman.
Well,
I'll tell you that.
But I'm about to gavel you down, so if you have a question, I suggest you.
I'm asking her: do you think there's maybe a reason that this was that President Trump's concern was justified?
You know, I can't speak for the president on this, but what I would say is you've listed a number of actions. I think from my point of view, that doesn't create a Ukrainian government strategy to interfere in our election.
I didn't say that.
Mr. Jordan, please allow the ambassador to answer the question.
So I would just say that, U.S. politicians will often criticize policies of foreign counterparts, even perhaps during their elections. This happens in politics, and I think that it doesn't necessarily constitute interference.
Would you ever write an op-ed
Jordan, your time
critical of
expired.
a presidential candidate in Ukraine?
Jordan, your time has expired. Mr. Welch, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like everybody here, I'm extraordinarily grateful to you for your career of public service, and I feel very badly about what you've had to endure. Like your colleagues, you don't complain. You're doing your job. I feel badly about the insults, the tweet this morning, the fact that you were smeared, not fired. But the question, as you know, is not how you were treated. Mm-hmm. The question is why the president did what he did and whether what he did was a breach of trust. The question really is about whether the President of the United States, any president, has the authority to withhold congressionally approved aid, to condition a White House meeting on extracting from a foreign leader a willingness to assist him in his political campaign. That's the question. And that brings us to you as part of this story, because the question is, why were you fired from that position? I want to read a portion of the president's call on July 25th with President Zelensky. And this is the painful part when you first heard about it. The former ambassador from the United States, the woman, was bad news, and the people she was dealing with in Ukraine were bad news. So I just want to let you know that. The other thing, he goes right into this. There's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of the people want to find out about that, so whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. You indicated in response to my colleague Mr. Castro's question that if you were asked to approach a foreign leader and condition American support on their being involved in our campaign, you would refuse to do that.
Yes, yes.
And you're aware now, but I don't know if you were then, but that July 25th phone call occurred the day after Director Mueller reported that the interference in our 2016 campaign was not from Ukraine. It was active, concerted, energetic, and by the Russians, correct?
Yes.
Now, as ambassador, you had no knowledge of whatever it is President Trump ultimately seems to have wanted to get for cooperation in this investigation. Isn't that's correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, you've been asked about whether a president has authority to replace an ambassador, and you have agreed that that's the president's prerogative.
Yes, that's true.
But that assumes that the reasons are not related to the personal, private, political interest of the president at the expense of our national security, right?
Yes.
And you've been the target of insults from the president. You join some very distinguished company, by the way, Senator McCain, General Kelly, man I admire, I think all of us do, General Mattis. We're not here to talk about that unless the reason you get insulted as you did today, essentially blaming you for Somalia, is if this is another step by the president to intimidate witnesses. He didn't intimidate you. You're here. You've endured. But there are other people out there that can expect the Trump treatment if they come forward. That's a question for us. Now, you also indicated that the president has a prerogative to appoint a non-career person, and to be candid, Republican presidents and Democratic presidents have done that. Mr. Sondland's transcript is out, and he was someone who indicated that everything hinged, the White House meeting and the release of the vital defensive aid, everything hinged on the President Zelensky being willing to do that investigation that would benefit the Trump campaign. You're aware of that?
Yes.
And you've indicated that's something that you would not agree to do.
Yes.
And Sondland was quite willing to do.
Apparently so.
I thank you for your professional service, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Maloney.
Ambassador Yovanovitch, thank you for being here. It's been a long day. You know, the first time we met, it wasn't clear, and so I just want to start with a quick comment. But, you know, your testimony in this inquiry broke the dam, you were the first one through that stone wall that the president was trying to set up. And I just want to thank you for that, because others have followed your example. And there's an old expression that first person through the wall gets a little bit bloody. And I think you must understand that expression in a new way. But thank you.
Thank you.
I want to ask you about the day you were let go. And I know this is a painful series of events, so forgive me, but I think it's very important. It's April 24th, and you told us a few things that really stuck with me. You said you were at the embassy in Ukraine, you were honoring a Ukrainian woman, anti-corruption activist. I believe her name is Katerina Handziuk. Is
That's
that correct?
Yeah.
Am I saying that correctly?
I was at my house.
You were at your house, excuse me. And you were giving her the Woman of Courage Award, I believe.
Yeah, the Embassy Kiev's Woman of Courage Award.
Right. And of course, that's the day you get a call from Carol Perez, a senior member of the Foreign Service. Did you know Carol Perez?
Yes.
You're both senior women in the Foreign Service. You had an opportunity to meet her before.
Yes.
And she says there's trouble coming. Want to give you a heads up. Correct me if I get this wrong. And I don't know a lot, but it's coming from the White House. I'll call you later.
Yeah, that sums it up.
But you're literally that evening honoring this anti-corruption activist. Is that right?
Yes.
And not just any woman, but a woman who was, you said, horribly attacked and killed for her efforts. And she wasn't just killed. You said I believe that someone threw acid on her.
That's correct.
And I went and I checked during the break, and it turns out she was horribly injured, and it took 4 months for her to die. Is that right?
A very painful death.
Why would somebody attack her with acid? There are easier ways to kill people. Why do you think they did it with acid?
Well, I think they wanted her out of the way, but I think the message was this could happen to you too if you continue her work.
That's what happens when you go up against corrupt people in Ukraine.
It is something that can happen. I mean, there are other ways of sidelining people.
Do you remember speaking at that event?
I do.
I went and looked at what you said. You said, Katerina paid the ultimate price for her fearlessness in fighting against corruption and for her determined efforts to build a democratic Ukraine. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
And then your phone rings, and you hear this trouble up the street. And Carol Perez called you back later that night, right? Mm-hmm. It was 1 a.m., I believe.
Yes.
Were you sleeping?
No.
You had stayed up?
Yes.
To get the phone call?
Yes.
And that's when she says two things, I believe, that really stuck with me. She said, we're worried about your security.
Yes.
You've just been honoring a woman who was killed for fighting for her anti-corruption efforts. And she says, you got to get on the next plane. Was she speaking euphemistically, get on the next plane, when you get time? Did she mean literally the next plane?
Well, I think she meant, as soon as possible. But pretty much it was the next plane.
And that's a pretty good flight back from Kyiv to Washington, and you're on your way to meet with Deputy Secretary Sullivan.
Yes.
And he says to you two things. He says there was a concerted effort against you, and he says you've done nothing wrong.
Right.
And what I'm fascinated about is when he says you've done nothing wrong, what did you expect the United States government would do next?
Please
it was pretty clear that a decision had been med by the president, implemented by the State Department, that I had to leave Ukraine. But I'd hoped that there would be more public support.
Did you expect them to have your back?
Yes.
Well, sure she did.
And were you surprised when you found out they weren't gonna?
Not at that point anymore.
Why?
Well, because
she knew
over the last several months, that had not been the case.
She knew that she was going to be the fall guy. She knew that she was being ousted. She knew that she was being blackballed.
Ma'am, in your opening statement, you said, how could our system fail like this?
Yeah.
How is it that foreign corrupt interests could manipulate our government? How could our system fail like this? How is it that foreign corrupt interests could manipulate our government? I want you to know, ma'am, that is the very question we are determined to get an answer for. And I want to thank you on behalf of your country for your service and with our work in answering that question. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Ms. Dennings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, everyone in this room should be thankful for your service to our nation. I have 4 little girls in my life, and as I sit here thinking about them, and as a woman, I cannot be prouder of you, and I consider you an inspiration for women around the world.
Amen.
I just have to say before I get into my questioning is, I think it's disgraceful to hear my colleagues refer to your sworn testimony as a performance today, or speak in a condescending way, basically suggesting that the woman, because I think that's how the president referred to you, I'm not sure he knows your name or there's some other meaning there, but to basically suggest that the woman should be thankful for whatever she was left with, smear campaign and all, after you were recalled. But I want you to know today that we thank you for your service, your 33 years of service. Ambassador, on a press conference call on October 17th, acting White House Chief of Staff Mulvaney discussed his belief that it's entirely appropriate to politicize U.S. foreign policy. Here's what he said. If you read the news reports and you believe them, what did McKinley say yesterday? Well, McKinley said yesterday that he was really upset with the political influence in foreign policy. That was one of the reasons he was so upset about this. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. Ambassador Yovanovitch, do you share the concern raised by Ambassador McKinley in testimony before this committee about political influence in foreign policy?
Well, as I said before, I think it's important to keep political influence out of foreign policy because we all, whether we are Republican or Democrats or something else, have common security interests, and that needs to be safeguarded and advanced.
And what message do you think it sends to other foreign service officers and public service, which we so desperately need good ones, when an administration refuses to support its own officials in the face of a smear campaign?
Well, it's deeply troubling. It's deeply troubling, and there are morale issues at the State Department.
Morale issues at the State Department.
Amen.
I can understand why. On March 20th of 2019, President Trump tweeted an article that included a letter from Representative Pete Sessions that said you had, and I quote, spoken privately and repeatedly about your disdain for the current administration in a way that might call for the expulsion of you as your ambassador to Ukraine immediately. Did you speak publicly and privately about your disdain for the Trump administration?
No.
Why do you think the president would want to push such a lie?
I don't know. I don't know.
Policies change, but U.S. interests don't. Not for those who are seeking to do the work of protecting our nation, the work you have done for decades. The president, his chief of staff, and his allies seem to want nothing more than to smear the good people trying to protect this country and to hijack our institutions for their personal and political gain. Again, Ambassador, we thank you so much for your service, and I'll yield my remaining time to the chairman.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. I'm going to go to Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Good afternoon, Ambassador, and thank you to the family as well for being here in support of you today. I'd like to direct you to an area of bipartisanship, namely aid to Ukraine. Congress, on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis, has appropriated hundreds of millions of dollars in military assistance to Ukraine, correct?
Yes.
And that aid is being used by Ukraine to fight a common adversary, namely Russia, right?
Yes.
The U.S., in fact, has consistently partnered with other European countries to keep Russia at bay and maintain the peace in Europe, right?
Yes.
As Ambassador Taylor suggested earlier this week, supporting Ukraine helps maintain peace so that Americans don't have to go to war again in Europe, right?
Yes.
Suspending that aid and weakening Ukraine can increase the likelihood of the opposite, correct?
Yes, it is extremely short-sighted.
The last time you were in Ukraine was May 20th of this year, right?
Yes.
In his opening statement, Ambassador Taylor said he took charge in Ukraine on June 17th.
Yes.
Therefore, there was almost a 1-month gap between the time you departed and when Taylor took over, right?
Yes. Yes.
During that time, on May 20th, Ambassador Sondland, Rick Perry, and others came to the inauguration of President Zelensky, right?
Yes.
And during that gap in time, Ambassador Sondland visited the White House, along with others, and got directions from President Trump to talk to Rudy. Those were his words. Talk to Rudy about what to do in Ukraine, right?
That's my understanding.
In other words, isn't it the case that your departure and the 1-month gap between the time you left and when Ambassador Taylor arrived provided the perfect opportunity for another group of people to basically take over Ukraine policy? Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Ambassador, you're going to have to speak a little louder into the mic.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. On page 10 of your opening statement, you mentioned, quote unquote, corrupt interests apparently hijacking our Ukraine policy, right?
Yes.
A couple suspect individuals in that regard were Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, right?
Yes.
You mentioned in response to Minority Counsel earlier that you learned that Fruman and Parnas were attempting to open a liquefied natural gas company, correct?
Yes.
How'd you learn that, by the way?
I heard it from the Minister of Interior.
Interestingly, at noon today, the Wall Street Journal reported that federal prosecutors in Manhattan are investigating whether Rudy Giuliani stood to personally profit from that liquefied natural gas venture. Do you have any knowledge of that?
No, I do not.
Maybe we should talk to Rudy, huh? Ambassador, I'd like to direct you to another line of questioning that I had for Ambassador Taylor earlier this week. He said that there were irregular channels of diplomacy at work in Ukraine, circumventing normal diplomatic channels and threatening American interests in favor of private interests. I asked him the question, can you rule out the possibility that these irregular channels of diplomacy are being used in other countries where we conduct foreign policy? In response, he said that he could not rule it out. Ambassador Yovanovitch, I ask you, and I assume that you can't rule it out either, correct?
I can't, but I would also add I have no knowledge of that.
I understand. Are you concerned that these irregular channels of diplomacy may be at work elsewhere?
I think it's a possibility.
You testified that it was a quote-unquote dangerous precedent that private interests and people who don't like a particular ambassador could combine to replace that ambassador. Are you concerned that other ambassadors may suffer the same fate as you?
Yes.
Wow.
Ambassador, in your service as an American diplomat, you have encountered various dictators and strong men ruling other countries, right?
Yes.
In your personal life, your parents fled the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and they became familiar with despots and dictators as well, correct?
Yes.
Indeed, you're an authority on authoritarianism, right?
Well, maybe.
Is it a feature of authoritarianism to allow corrupt interests to hijack foreign policy?
Yeah.
Is it a feature of authoritarianism for the rulers there to claim absolute rights?
Yes.
And is it a hallmark of authoritarianism for those rulers to smear their opponents?
Sometimes, yes.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Nunes, do you have any concluding remarks?
I would just say to the American people, today's show trial has come to an end. We're headed down now to the basement of the Capitol to go until I don't know what time, we'll be back there hiding again behind the closed doors, interviewing more witnesses that you may or may not be able to see in the public. I hate to break it to my colleagues if there's anyone else out there watching television ratings, but they must be plummeting right now. And I would suggest that we get back to the work of the Intelligence Committee, that we pass a trade agreement with the United States, Mexico, and Canada that would actually help the American people out, because this is an embarrassment. I'll yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I be recognized for a motion?
No, I have some concluding remarks. Ambassador, I want to thank you for your decades of service. I want to thank you, as Mr. Maloney said, for being the first one through the gap. What you did in coming forward and answering a lawful subpoena was to give courage to others that also witnessed wrongdoing, that they too could show the same courage that you have, that they could stand up, speak out, answer questions. They could endure whatever threats, insults may come their way. And so in your long and distinguished career, you have done another great public service in answering the call of our subpoena and testifying before us today. I think you gathered from our comments that we not only grieve for what you went through, but what damage is being done to the State Department, to career federal foreign service officers all over the country. I am profoundly grateful to you and Mr. Kent and Ambassador Taylor, who have done so much in the last 2 days or 3 days to show the American people the face of our diplomatic corps. The extraordinary public servants who work all around the world in very dangerous places, as you have. And so I'm glad they've gotten to see you, because you're often vilified as bureaucrats, or diplomacy is diminished as unimportant. Anything other than military doesn't really matter, when it's your efforts that often prevent us from going to war. Sometimes you're disparaged as the deep state. But what you are is what holds this country together, what holds our foreign policy together, what makes it seamless, what makes it work. And I'm glad America gets to see that. I will just emphasize once again about the importance of your testimony. Mr. Kent and Ambassador Taylor gave us the broad outlines of this story. This is a story about an effort to coerce, condition, or bribe a foreign country into doing the dirty work of the president, investigations of his political rival, by conditioning U.S. taxpayer money, by conditioning a meeting that President Zelensky desperately wanted and needed to establish that relationship with the most powerful patron of Ukraine, the United States of America. The fact that they failed in this solicitation of bribery doesn't make it any less bribery, doesn't make it any less immoral or corrupt.
Right.
It just means it was unsuccessful.
Means it was tainted. Just as if there was a homegrown domestic terrorist attack with some school kid that had spewed it on media platform that he or she was fixing to do such and such and so, and a good detective or a good cop or a good investigator caught it and spoiled their intent. That's exactly what's happened here. Once more, these people are in fact the workhorses. You ordinarily don't ever see them. You ordinarily don't ever hear about them, because they're in behind the shadows towards actually doing the grunt work. And because the whistleblower come forth, it appears that Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States of America, that was saying, nanny boo boo, nanny boo boo, has now been captured or caught with his hand in the cookie jar.
And to that we owe other dedicated
Absolutely.
public servants who blew the whistle.
Absolutely.
Had they not blown the whistle, we wouldn't be here.
Right.
I think it is appalling that my colleagues continue to want to out this whistleblower so that he or she can be punished by this president. But let's
punished? He was wanting to put out a contract on him.
Or once again, while you are the beginning of this story, you're not the end of it, but nonetheless, the beginning is important because the beginning of the story is an effort to get you out of the way, an effort by Rudy Giuliani and Fruman and Parnas and corrupt Ukrainians like Lutsenko, to get you out of the way.
Right.
Because they felt you were an impediment to these political investigations the president so desperately wanted.
Right.
Giuliani has made it abundantly clear he was in Ukraine on a mission for his client, for the president, to investigate the Bidens.
Right.
And you were viewed as an obstacle that had to go.
Right.
Not just by Giuliani, but by the president of the United States. And
Right.
if people had any doubt about it,
right.
they should do what the president asks.
Right.
Read the transcript.
Right.
And what they'll see in that transcript is the president praises the corrupt. He praises the corrupt, Lutsenko. He condemns the just,
right.
you.
Right.
And then he asks for an investigation of the Bidens.
Right.
There is no camouflaging that corrupt intent.
That is proof in the pudding right there.
We are adjourned.
Mr. Speaker, on condition.
Please allow the witness to
Mr.
leave.
Chairman, you
Please allow the
disparage
witness to leave.
those members on this side of the aisle. We should have a chance to respond to your disparaging remarks. Mr. Chairman, I demand to speak. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman.
Wow, what an outburst.
It has been a topsy-turvy day of unexpected, unanticipated twists and turns in the second public day of testimony in the impeachment proceedings into Donald J. Trump. A veteran of the career Foreign Service, Marie Yovanovitch, who served as the ambassador, U.S. ambassador in Ukraine until she was called at 1 a.m. and told for her security to get on the next plane out of Ukraine. Yovanovitch, not just a witness to the shadow campaign, but a victim of it. A victim, the first victim of Rudy Giuliani's smear campaign against her, campaign that's under scrutiny by prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, sometimes referred to as SDNY. Headlines today that office's investigation into two of Rudy Giuliani's associates now includes an investigation into Rudy Giuliani and some of his business dealings. Whether or not they intersect with anything we heard today from Marie Yovanovitch is a known unknown at this hour. What we do know, Republicans spent a lot of their time reading seemingly unrelated headlines into the record and trying to compliment Marie Yovanovitch after Donald Trump seemed to make an effort at tampering with this witness and intimidating her earlier today. Chris.
Earlier today. This isn't something that went on in July or August or September. This went on today. Today.
What do you think the lasting impact of today will be? Before we came on the air, we're listening to a spontaneous round of applause for Ambassador Yovanovitch.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, the news today will be from the morning where the president tweeted his attempt to intimidate the witness, in the words of the chair, that he went in there attacking her, saying she's caused mishigas around the world. Wherever she's going, it's been going to hell, as if it's her personal responsibility how the world goes. But it was an attempt to really smear her in real time, and it may well be part of the impeachment indictment that the House puts together, first or second articles. I thought it's interesting just in terms of competition. I mean, I am a political person. I was watching the two dugouts when we had the last intermission there. The Democrats were all laughing together. I know this is just partisan, but there's a partisan aspect to this. They had a winning witness today. They had a star who hit many home runs today. The Republican side, in a couple of ways, they looked miserable, first of all. They looked angry because they had a bad day. But they also avoided Anita Hill moments. They were very careful not to be Arlen Specter or Orrin Hatch. There was none of these back and forth with the woman witness, the woman as the president called her. None of those strong, stern, indicting questions that they can be used against them in the next election. I think these men, they were all men except for Stefanik, knew they were on very dangerous territory here with this witness.
Nice.
If they go after somebody that fine, they're the bad guy. And I think they were it's what they didn't do this afternoon. They didn't follow up. Even Jordan was pretty measured. And these cowboys out there decided this is no time to mess with her. They knew what the picture was going to look like tonight and tomorrow.
And I guess if that's where we are, that the best thing we can say about the Republicans is there were no Anita Hill moments, then that's where we are.
Yeah, but one thing is like very crystal clear at this moment. There was one question asked in the opening statement of this amazing American woman, and it was, why was I smeared? Why was I removed? That was the question that hung over the hearing room hour after hour after hour.
Why was I infuriated and intimidated by the federal authorities up in Paducah, Kentucky, simply for fasting and praying for a revival pertaining to trying to rid evil from society? Ask that question to somebody. Why was I put into not only a place that I didn't want to be, pertaining to going to MCC in downtown Chicago, give or take for about 5.5 months, but then the same group of people from the same state done it again. After that, I had cleared my name in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, towards them putting me through the same BS in the same state, towards this time spending 9.5 months in their accommodations. Trigg County, Hopkinsville, Kentucky, LaGrange, Kentucky, being analyzed and studied like a laboratory rat. And then on top of that, why was I targeted after coming back home to my home state, to my home county, and treated like I was some sort of a terrorist, or treated like I was going to do some sort of bodily harm to a bunch of innocent people? Why was I treated the way that I was treated? I'm going to tell you why. Because evil in this world thinks that it can dominate good. Thank God that we have people like her that are willing to stand up and that is not afraid to put her very, very life on the line for the value of others, so that others can live, so that others can prosper, so that others can go forth. God bless people like her. God bless people that still stand up for the integrity of our Constitution and democracy as far as goodness and grace according to the Christian values.
And you know what the Republicans came with? Crickets.
Yeah.
Nothing. As Ambassador McFall said, no one even attempted to try to explain why they needed to get her out of Ukraine quickly, and why it was this whole campaign to smear her and remove her came about. We know what it is now. Looking at it from a distance, we can tell what it was. But it is really interesting to me that they wanted to somehow make it about, we don't know who the whistleblower is, or, some people in Ukraine didn't like Trump because he was saying that Russia deserved Crimea. Well, what did Trump think that people in Ukraine were going to do when he said in the campaign, well, Russia deserves Crimea? Of course they were not going to be for him.
But if she had been drawn into that,
she wouldn't let herself be drawn in.
She was so disciplined. It was because if she'd been drawn into a reasonable argument about why the Ukrainians would be upset, then she would have been partisan.
Right.
They would have nailed her.
Right.
Chairman Schiff has just approached the microphones. Let's listen in.
So I just wanted to share a few observations after the testimony today. I think we could all see what an incredible public servant Ambassador Yovanovitch is. We are so fortunate to have dedicated professionals like her serving around the world. She's served in some of the most dangerous places and has done so always with great distinction, with great courage.
Amen.
Under fire, sometimes quite literally. She showed that same, I think, level of devotion and
Amen.
courage and commitment to country today.
Amen.
So we're grateful to her. We're grateful to the other witnesses that have testified as well, who show the country what it means to be a public servant, what it means to be a career Foreign Service officer. We're enormously proud of them. That she had to endure yet another attack today, even as she was testifying for the President of the United States, is just appalling. But as we have observed so often, appalling in this administration is not the least bit surprising. Nonetheless, she endured the attack and went on. We're grateful for that. But it is quite clear.
It's not just appalling. It's grossly appalling. Any president, knowing that everything that he says and does at this particular moment is being judged by the American people. It's grossly appalling.
That, I think from her testimony, as well as others, that Rudy Giuliani and the president felt it was necessary to get her out of the way. That notwithstanding what the president and others were told about her dedication to country, her commitment to fighting corruption, if anything, her commitment to fighting corruption was part of the reason why she was pushed out. Pushing her out made it possible to put in the three amigos to conduct Ukraine policy. If there were any doubt about why she was pushed out, I think the call record eliminates that doubt. It is apparent from that call record that the president associated his bias in favor of this corrupt prosecutor, Lutsenko, with the need to push out Yovanovitch, with the need to move forward with the investigations he wanted of his political rival. That a U.S. ambassador would be so shamelessly smeared and cast aside to further this corrupt effort just adds further insult to the injury done to the country and to our national security.
It's sickening.
Thank you.
Chairman, real quick question. What's your expectation for next week? Can you help us understand why you have the witnesses paired the way you do? And the expectation is Fiona Hill's public testimony will be the last public hearing that your committee will hear in this impeachment proceeding.
Well, we have, as you've seen, we've combined witnesses from time to time on different panels, depending on how long we think the testimony of any one witness may go. We've also tried at times to accommodate schedules, but mostly the witnesses have accommodated us. In terms of whether Ambassador Hill will be the final testimony, I'm not prepared to say. But as we have endeavored all along, we are moving expeditiously, but we are trying to move methodically.
Chairman, on the issue of witness intimidation, there's been talk today that this could potentially be considered impeachable. Is it more obstruction of justice or abuse of power in your view?
Well, I would say that the president's attack on a witness today is not something that we view in isolation. This is part of a pattern of the President of the United States, a pattern that goes back to praising Paul Manafort for not cooperating, condemning Michael Cohen.
And how many times have all of us said, the president don't know how to leave his communication device alone, and he tweaks too much. He has basically self-incarcerated himself by some of the things that he has said and some of the things that he has done, and this is just that much more evidence stacked against him towards what he done today, towards making the statement against her. Once more, this woman was being punished for doing good. Punished for doing good. And because they knew that they was not going to be able to oust her as far as buying her off, corrupting her with the good old American dollar bill, the almighty money strategy, they had to get rid of her in another way, and I'm pretty sure somebody had caught whiff that if she did not get on that plane immediately, not only was she going to be ousted pertaining to her credibility as far as a smear campaign against her, but she was probably on somebody's radar towards going to be in somebody's, I hate to say it, but probably already a price had been paid towards actually taking her out in somebody's crosshairs. And they knew it. Because whenever you're dealing with this type of money and this type of corruption and these type of people over there in that area, oh my God. It is absolutely mind-blowing towards the corruption that President Putin and that whole group of people over there are instilling even to this day up onto their people. It took a lot of guts. I mean, it took a lot of courage for Ronald Reagan to stand on national TV and look at Brezhnev and Gorbachev at the time and say what he said in the regards towards demonizing that country over there pertaining to what that they was doing to their own people. It took a lot of guts at that time to stand up against that type of aggression and that type of barbaric evil. Nothing but evil. I mean, pure, mere evil. Towards captivating their people and putting them under that type of bondage. And to this day, it still goes on in places like in Honduras and places in South America and places over in China, Hong Kong. And that's the reason why we're seeing all these eruptions that's going on all over the planet right now, because the people are standing up against this type of slavery. It's the same thing as what the Pharaohs was doing to Moses and the Moses' people. And that's the reason why God hand chosen, selected. That's the reason why God, the Heavenly Father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, told Moses to tell Pharaoh to let my people go.
And as a rap because he was cooperating with authorities, attacking other witnesses who come forward suggesting that we ought to treat those like the whistleblower who exposed wrongdoing in his administration as we treat traitors and spies, and we used to execute traitors and spies. This is a part of a pattern to intimidate witnesses. And it's also part of a pattern to obstruct the investigation. It was also a part, frankly, of the pattern to obstruct justice. And so we need to view the president's actions today as part of a broader and incriminating pattern of conduct.
In other words, what he's saying, instead of just impeaching the president, maybe somebody should walk up to him with a pair of handcuffs and actually arrest him. That's basically what he just said. Criminal. Criminal.
The 2 days are the books.
That was Congressman Adam Schiff underscoring some of the developments today. Maya?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what was so important about what Adam Schiff said is that this is impeachable conduct that we've seen from the president.
No, he just said it went beyond impeachable to the point that maybe the man needs to go to jail. We know what he said.
Already had impeachable conduct just in barring Congress from getting access to fact witnesses and to documents to get the truth.
Right.
And if, in fact, the president did nothing wrong, why is the White House blocking information from getting to Congress so it can conduct its business, which is oversight? That's its job under the Constitution.
Maya, are you surprised that none of those arguments, I mean, those are not Democratic talking points. Those are about one branch of government and its oversight role. Are you surprised that no Republican walks out and makes any of your arguments?
This is security oversight. This ain't got nothing to do with Republican or Democrat. This is security oversight. This is the fundamentals of who we are and what we do.
I'm shocked because what they're essentially doing is ceding the power and the job responsibilities that they got elected to do. And when there's
when the shoe's on the other foot, are they weakening?
Yeah, listen, this is the Congress.
Weakening.
This is the Republican Party that complained when it couldn't get all the documents on Fast and Furious. Right? They have made these complaints.
Right.
All right, we are going to listen in to Jim Jordan for a minute.
The Fast and Furious pertaining to what went on down on the border that affected the Davidians.
Third witness who was not on the call.
Or that's what I'm assuming that she's thinking or saying. I may be wrong about that now. She may actually be talking about another event pertaining to the Fast and Furious. This guy here, as far as I'm concerned, he's digging his own political grave by standing up trying to defend a crazy man.
Third witness who wasn't even, as I said, in Ukraine when the relevant, during the relevant time frame. Wasn't even there when President Zelensky that left before he was even inaugurated as the new president. So again, 4 facts, I say this every time, but it's the truth. 4 facts have never changed, will never change. We got the call transcript. There was no conditionality or linkage on the call between
the investigation. Yes, it was. Quit lying.
Security assistance. We have the 2 individuals on the call who both said that there was no pressure, no linkage. We know that...
God, maybe he needs to go to the psychiatric ward too, along with Donald Trump.
The Ukrainian...
Look at the expression on that woman's face to the left of him, which would be to our right. She's like, I'm hearing you, but I'm not feeling you no more, old boy. And the expression on all of them's face. Look at them. They look like they just lost their best buddy. Look at the expression on their faces. It's self-explanatory.
Didn't even know aid was withheld or on hold at the time of the call. And most importantly, the Ukrainians, specifically President Zelensky.
He's just spewing off a bunch of stuff, hoping that it's going to sound good to the American people. And basically all you're doing, my friend, is you're digging your own hole. along with Donald Trump. And is not that what that guy said before he went to jail, that those who was associated with Donald Trump will fall into his own entrapment? That Donald Trump speaks in codes. In other words, he don't just come right out and say what he wants you to do. He does it in different methods, different ways. You're dealing with somebody that goes beyond anything that Slick Willie ever thought about doing pertaining to having an inappropriate relationship with a intern pertaining to Monica Lewinsky. And you're dealing with something that goes beyond anything that President Nixon was ever accused of. You're dealing with something that is a treasonable act, that if this was to have occurred during the 1800s, they would probably put Donald Trump on the wall and have him executed. Thank God we no longer live underneath those type of laws and bylaws. It was after World War I that our whole structure changed in those regards towards doing some of the rootless stuff that we done back then in that era. But if we was to go back to Andrew Jackson's era and some of those other eras, what Donald Trump has done would be considered treasonous. And this guy here, he's digging his own hole. He's digging his own political hole to the point that whenever Donald Trump goes down, he'll probably go, his political career will probably be over with.
Never took any official action to get the aid released. And so those facts never change and will never change. Don't let Ms. Stefanik say a word and then we'll take the question.
Sure. So this was day 2 of an abject failure of Adam Schiff and his regime of secrecy. As we saw today, he is making up the rules as he goes. He did not let Republicans put forth any unanimous consents. He did not let us control our own time, Republican members' time.
He didn't want it to be a free-for-all. He's the chairman. They want things done in an orderly, professionally form.
I think I was interrupted about 6 times throughout the hearing. So this is just more of the ridiculous abuse of power that we're seeing from Adam Schiff. I think
ridiculous power towards wanting to keep things in an orderly form. Wow. Can you get over that?
one of the most important facts that came across today, Ambassador Yovanovitch testified that the president can appoint ambassadors at will. That is important. The president has a right to pick who his or her ambassador.
And I have a right to shoot a domesticated animal that walks across my yard, too. Living out here in Timbuktu, out here in the middle of the country, out here in the middle of the sticks. But morally speaking, after I've shot that domesticated animal and blowed it to smithereens, I still got to live with the neighbor that the animal belonged to down the road. So, in actuality, yeah, I've got the right, under whatever pretense, as long as I'm willing to live with the circumstances towards losing that neighbor as a neighbor, or possibly even a friend. We know what's going on here. We're not blind to what we see. And you can try to do a smear tactic. You can put all the Band-Aids on it. You can say this. You can use the hypotheticals all you want. But the bottom line is we know what we heard today. And we know what we heard the day before yesterday pertaining to opening testimonies. And now we're understanding the incentive, the hidden legenda in behind Donald Trump doing what he was doing. And just as Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has said, all roads leads back to President Putin, which is contrary to what Ronald Reagan was trying to accomplish whenever he demonized that society over there that was ruling their people, just as Pharaoh was ruling the children of Israel.
Ambassadors are. And then in my line of questioning, I just wanted to highlight the Obama State Department was so concerned about conflicts of interest with Hunter Biden sitting on Burisma's board that the Obama State Department, that was the first instance where Ambassador Yovanovitch had ever heard the word Burisma. That's an important fact to note for all of the viewers here today. So we're going to continue asking about Hunter Biden's role on Burisma on behalf of the millions of Americans who want to know the answer to that question. And then on the whistleblower, it is important to note that Adam Schiff, and I listed all of the instances of this, Adam Schiff initially in September said he was adamant about hearing from the whistleblower, and it only changed when it became clear that there was coordination between Democratic staff and the whistleblower before the whistleblower complaint was issued.
Let me just do two other.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that. What she just said was a coordinated effort. I don't believe that. The whistleblower had already went to the House towards making sure that he or she was not in violation of classified information. I heard those remarks a month ago. I'm keeping up with this. We're micromanaging this, folks.
So when it's transparent, they know by House resolution, they ruled that the opening statement would be shared between the ranking member and his counsel. That's it. There'd be no one else they can yield to. And right in front of the cameras there, they tried to yield to Stefanik so she would do her usual hit job. You know, that's aiming at people who don't know what they're doing. They're aiming at the audience that hasn't been following it, haven't read the paper, doesn't know what they're doing. And it falls upon the Democrats, I say, to at each point they're not doing it, correct their record. Make sure Schiff should have read out at that moment the resolution that said only ranking members and the chair and their counsels are allowed to talk in those first 45 minutes, which they worked out through the whole House. And those people were able to act like they're getting cheated. The tropes here are we're being treated unfairly. There's a transparency problem here. When there's 40 Republicans going down in the, now it's called the basement, now it's called the bunker. It's the skip, but they're going to make it weirder and weirder. But there's 40 Republicans down there. Yeah, they keep doing this. And by the way, when they testify down there in the skiff, that's secret cult-like behavior. When they come forward and repeat their testimony, it's called a performance. There's no way you can satisfy the critics because their goal here is righteous indignation for the 40% of the country that buys this stuff. By the way, I've never heard politicians talk through talking points by listing the talking points. They actually list 1, 2, 3. They actually, you know, we've been in that business, but they actually say, here are my talking points. And they go through them. And they're the same all the time.
Well, but the amazing thing is they said, oh, the news that Donald Trump threatened our witness in real time.
That's a tweet.
I'm not going to talk about that. That's a tweet. I mean, the idea, too, that anything untoward has gone on. I actually think that the speed with which the transcripts have been made public is remarkable. And a SCIF, just for anyone who doesn't know, is a secure briefing room. It's usually used for reading and sharing classified information, and it's to do the opposite of what they...
Come out of the dark ages. We're no longer living in the prehistoric days. We're in the 21st century. Stuff is done instantly now. Instantly. We have a thing called the internet, the computer. We're no longer living in prehistoric days.
Say everything that's happened in those skiffs or bunkers has been released to the public. So the Republicans, you know, they're dancing so quickly because the attacks are sort of undermined almost as soon as they come out of the mouth.
Well, Nicole, a skiff is the opposite of a restaurant in Kiev. When you go to the local restaurant, there is a room of spies.
You know what? I'm glad you said that.
And you immediately start talking on your little walkie-talkie to the President of the United States who picks up the call.
Right. So Trump should be in a skiff. All right, David Holmes, though. So we had a little bit of news made there, or since we've been on the air, and I think Jeff Bennett's with us. Jim Jordan talking about a new witness in a closed-door deposition. His name is David Holmes. The significance here, the bombshell from the first day of public testimony came from Ambassador Taylor, who added to his public record of testimony that there was another call, another conversation between President Donald Trump and his hand-picked ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland. And on that call, Donald Trump asked Gordon Sondland, hey, what about the investigations? This was the day after the call between Zelensky and Trump. So the only thing on Trump's mind wasn't, we're going to get them their aid. It wasn't, how'd it go?
I want to thank all my viewers for watching this. Those who took time to
what do we know
interest
about
themselves in this.
Witness, when he was called, and how long this deposition is scheduled to go today?
Well, Nicole, House Republicans are keeping this new key witness waiting. He arrived here on Capitol Hill almost an hour ago, but over my...
This will be the end to part 3. The second part in part 3. Thanks again. God bless.